if there's a battle between your intentional part of your brain and the brainstem that regulates your physiological state, basically the foundational survival circuits in your body, who do you think will win? So if your
Yeah.
body's in a state of defense, forget the intentionality. It's just not going to be there. And when you mention the word compassion, that's what we have to think about. That why is the body in a state of threat? Because the body itself is detecting cues of threat and literally is interpreting the world, at least for the child, that the world is a very, very dangerous world. Let's start off with a simple principle, which most of us have forgotten because we're both either parents or we were children at one point, and that is our physiological state influences our behavior. And we tend not to acknowledge that. We think that behavior is intentional. And we come at it literally in educational world and parenting worlds with literally a behavioral worldview that if you really want to be sit still and to listen and to process and be polite, you can. We tend not to understand that when our body gets into certain states, like states of threat, the only priority is our own survival. So we have to start understanding that basically if the body shifts state, you better get you want to get off that horse. So if it gets into a state of mobilization and aggressiveness, you're not going to make a contact through intentionality or through punishment. So polyvagal theory starts with this premise that in between the external world or stimulation or stimuli or cause and the body's response or the effects is our nervous system. And our nervous system can be in different states. It can be in this calm state where it supports health, growth, and restoration. It can be in a calm state where we're contemplative and we're thoughtful and we're generous and benevolent. Or it can be in literally a state of fight flight where we mobilize all our resources to protect ourselves, or in a state of literally overwhelming threat where we shut down and disappear literally within our own body and become numb. And you see all three of those attributes in virtually everyone's life. And you see it in the classroom, you see it in parenting. And the issue is to understand that those physiological states are functionally neural platforms for the behaviors that we have.
Yeah, so I think we are taught, when we think of psychology and the rise of behaviorism, that, a child does X, Y, and Z, that you add, either reinforcement or you add
Yeah.
punishment, and that the child has a choice. But ultimately, if the child is in a stress response, they've exited the logical
Mm.
part of their brain. So they're out
Yeah.
of their prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
but that they're in a state possibly of, fight flight, where
Mm.
they're kind of, I think Mona Delahooke calls it, that would be your red zone, where
Mm.
they're kind of in that state of protection where they want to exit, or they're going to get aggressive to protect themselves, or they're in that numbed out, shut down
Yeah.
response. But ultimately, it's all states of fear, protection, and
Yeah.
stress. And parents have a hard time with that because they'll say, well, my child just got the wrong color of cup. What does that have to do with safety? And what would you
Mm.
say to that? Because I get
Okay,
asked that.
so it's very simple, and that is what actions trigger a nervous system to move into a state of threat. The simplest one is violation of expectancy, which is the example you gave. Because expectancy to our nervous system is literally open ended. It could be open ended, which means it's threatening. So when we deal with what we would call flexible and resilient children, violation of expectancy is fun. They like that. It's exploration. But if your body is a little bit tentative in this world, in the sense you're very threat or conflict aversive, then violation of predictability is triggering the body to be in a state of threat.
So is it the unpredictability is what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
that and I mean, the
Yeah.
more anxious the child, the more
Mm.
difficult that is when they don't have control, when things don't go the way they want.
Yeah, we can play for a moment with the word anxious. So we think of it
Okay.
as a psychological one, and we say to people, "Why are you so anxious? Don't be so anxious." Let's throw that word away and say, "What if our body's in a state of threat, and our psychological experience is that of being anxious? Do we change the way we treat the child or treat ourselves or others? We say, can I calm my bodily down? Then the anxiety just won't be there. So we have to understand that the psychological experience of anxiety is the brain's interpretation of a lower brainstem state of being in a state of threat, a foundational survival threat response. But the point is that we tend to think of behavior as being intentional. And I think that is really the take home message from polyvagal theory. What about all the behaviors that are being driven by our physiology being in a state of threat? Then we get into the question, what is triggering the threat? So let's separate that we are physiologically, a lot of anxious kids, a lot of instances, a lot of depressed children now, a lot of suicidal thoughts. These are these are physiologies that are not safe. So they're not supporting health, growth, and restoration. And we get confused. We start thinking of these as psychological phenomenon, meaning they have no physiological validity. But threat reactions are on mental levels, psychological levels, behavioral levels, and physiological levels. So that's why you start getting all these comorbidities. So when you're looking at children, highly anxious kids often have a lot of gut problems. And
Yeah.
what it's telling you is really that their nervous system is not safe enough to support these uh, processes that we'll call homeostatic, which are health, growth, and restoration. So being in a threat state, our body shifts priorities rather than taking care of its own organs, healing, growing, digesting food. It's in a state of threat. The analogy is Star Trek, where the Enterprise, the spaceship, has to move its energy from power to do various things or fight or fly to put up defense shields. The defense shields are metabolically costly. They divert the nervous system from its primary goals of health, growth, restoration, and sociality. So what we start finding out is the anxious child, the child with the gut problems, often has social behavioral issues as well.
Yeah. And I know in your gut too, I'll give you an analogy that we give clients and you tell us if no, you're going to tell us if this is right. When we think of emotion regulation, so our child is having a tantrum or your teenager says you're the worst mom in the world, whatever that is. Like it's a big moment. There's a big feeling there. What we tell everyone who works with us, our clients, our podcast listeners is the first question we want to look at is neuroception of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Say, does this child feel safe? The second question is, do they feel loved? Limbic system response connection. The third question is, do they feel capable? Can they understand? Can they problem solve? But the
Mm-hmm.
first thing we do
Yeah,
is look at the body and we look at that
yeah.
neuroception of safety.
Because we can understand that it's not a bad behavior. It's behavior at the service of survival. So we could call it very adaptive, but functionally it is maladaptive in the local environment. So for some reason, and this is where the clinical history, therapeutic interventions, uh, signals of threat are overwhelming that child's nervous system. And that's this neuroception. So what makes us and other social mammals unique in the whole, you know, family of vertebrate species is that not only can we detect and react to threat with a neuroception of defense and reactivity like a startle or pain, but we have a newer mammalian circuit, and this made the system polyvagal, that turns off threat reactions. So our whole nervous system evolved to enable connection and co-regulation with another. This is this remarkable aspect of signaling another of your species. And we can see this very easily when we have pets. So you have a dog or a cat. How do you talk to your dog or your cat? You use a very prosodic with intonation. Now, the question is, do you talk to your children the same way?
And
Not necessarily, because
if
you
they're
want to, quote, straighten them out. But what about your cat or your dog or your horse? You talk to them, say, pretty baby, lovely this, or,
easy, yeah.
yeah. And the animal gives up its defenses. And for cats and dogs, often they roll on their back and say, rub my belly. They're showing a very vulnerable ventral side. They're basically connecting and feeling safe with you. But we treat humans not on that level. We say you should be smart enough to understand what I want and what I mean. Uh, so we think it's all about what I say and not how I say it. So there's a real, we actually did this study that got published looking at babies, 9-month-old babies, when their mothers placed them under a stress procedure, which is called the still face procedure. It was
Oh,
developed by Ed Tronick, a real good
Oh,
friend of mine. But
oh.
you're already grimacing because what it is the mother basically
Face goes flat. Yeah, no
goes
no feeling
flat.
in the face.
And the initial reaction of the child often is to reach forward to try to literally comfort the mother and
Mm,
reconnect, even at 9 months. And then the child will get disorganized and go into tantrum at times. But the interesting part from a polyvagal perspective was the voice of the mother where she calmed the baby after the disruption.
after.
And we looked at distress indices of behavior and the baby's heart rate. If the voice was melodic,
Mm.
the baby's heart rate went down over 10 beats per minute within a few seconds, and
Oh,
distress behaviors literally disappeared. But the mother was still talking and engaging the child, but her voice was
flat.
less prosodic, virtually no effect. So it's telling you that there are signals of safety that are wired into our nervous system because you can't develop connection or trust in another unless you have that co regulation where the neuroception detects signals of safety.